This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Spring Creek Model Trains. Family owned for nearly 25 years, Spring Creek is your destination for model trains. Check out springcreekmodeltrains.com for a wide variety of offerings from today's top manufacturers and exclusive products found nowhere else. Whether in Deschler, Nebraska, or at a train show near you, stop in and say, wow. To see where they'll be next, visit their website at springcreekmodeltrains.com. It's time for you to submit your answer for the question of the month, our new feature where you get to be heard on Around the Layout. Our question this month: what is the number one factor you consider when purchasing a locomotive? Is it price, specific details, lighting, or something else? Go to aroundthelayout.com/question to give us your answer. Answers must be received by September 16th. So again, aroundthelayout.com/question. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. It's time, once again, to talk ops with Don Irace. And who other than Don Irace to do that with? Don, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ray. It's good to be back. Looking forward to this once-a-month op session stuff. And I can't wait to dig into it some more.
Yeah, and last time I saw you on a screen was not on this screen. It was through a virtual railfan cam. You had quite a trip out to Pennsylvania. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, we had fun. My father is the one that got me into this hobby. So he really never, once I started getting involved, he kind of, dabbled with it. But, he's a working man, had 3 kids. And I was the only one that even got involved in model railroad between me and my 2 brothers. So, he's really never been rail fanning before. So I asked him, I said, he watches the virtual rail cameras on TV, and he's kind of got focused in on the horseshoe curve. So I said, well, why don't we just go there, So we were supposed to do it last year, but something came up and we couldn't go. So this year I said, we're going. So he had a ball. When I got the horseshoe curve, I realized they're closed on Mondays and Tuesdays now. So I got there on Monday, and I was planning on going to Strasburg to ride the railroad there. So I'm like, well, what are we going to do? I said, I didn't drive all this way just to look at horseshoe curve from the street. I said, so we're going to get up early Tuesday morning afterward and eat breakfast, and we're going to jump in the car, check out the station inn is where we stayed. And we're going to shoot right over. It's only 10 minutes away from the station inn anyway. And we got there. It was like 10 minutes of 9. The gates weren't even open yet. So we just sat there and waited. We were the first ones in, went inside. First question out of my mouth, is the funicular running? No. I'm like, ugh. I said, so I told my father, says, look out the window. I said, those are the stairs to heaven up there. I said, you think a game? I said, he's 91 years old. I said, before we buy the tickets, I just want to make sure you're going to be able to get up there. He said, nah, I can do it. I do it. It took us about 20 minutes to get up there, but he got up there. The little flight stopped. And he kept looking around the corner. I says, what are you looking for? I'll see what it is. And there's a lot more stairs to go. I said, just keep on going. I said, so, but he got up there, and he just like, wow, it's to see it in person is different from looking at it, on a railfan camera. So, but we were there. We probably stayed there about an hour and a half because we really had to get to Strasburg because I had to catch the 2:00 Strasburg Railroad train. So we were really pressed for time. But he had a good time. We walked around. We caught 2 or 3 trains up there. And I think we probably could have stayed a couple extra days as far as he was concerned, but he had an eye doctor's appointment on Friday. And then, so he went to the eye doctor's appointment on Friday. He found out my eye doctor's appointment until Monday.
Oh, man.
Oh, my God, you got to be kidding.
Oh.
Right? So I said, oh, well. I said, maybe we'll go back there next year. We'll just go there and stay at the station there because he loved that. That was great. He just get up in the morning. You have your breakfast right there, and I think the place holds like 18 people, and everybody was there I mean, there was guys, they got a table the whole length of the porch. They got their laptops out. Who's watching the cameras? Who's got all the information on the Amtrak trains? And it's unbelievable how these guys are into that place, you know. And so we pulled up a couple of rocking chairs and nice pads, and we sat down that porch all day long and just watched all the trains go back and forth. I said, if we go from here or to Brickyard or down to Altoona, all the trains that are in Altoona all going to pass by here. I said, so we could just sit right here. And that's what we did. It was good for him. You just sit down and relax. You know, you can't, if we're somewhere parked, he gets out, watch the train go by, go back and sit in the car, sit down. And so it was easy just to let him sit right there. So, yeah, no, he had a good time. We both had a good time. He enjoyed that. So that was our experience at Horseshoe Curve.
That's awesome. A great opportunity for you to spend time with your dad out in Western Pennsylvania, checking out trains, and it was awesome to see you guys on the virtual rail cam and walking back and forth and enjoying that. And speaking of NS and the Norfolk Southern, we have a guest with us tonight. That would be the owner of the Seaboard Central and also an NS employee, Tim Garland. Tim, welcome to the show.
How you doing, Ray? How you doing, Don?
I'm doing good, Tim. Glad you're here.
Tim, the last time we were talking about his Seaboard Central, we interviewed a while back on that, but we never really got to talk about operations with Tim. So we're going to hear about the Seaboard Central and how Tim created the operations on that. So why don't you just give us a little bit of a background on the Seaboard Central and how you even got started with that Freelance Railroad?
No problem. I've been doing the Seaboard Central. Came up with the Seaboard Central in 1990. Of course, the operations plan has evolved ever since then. I keep tweaking it. I got hired on at Norfolk Southern in 1996 as a conductor. By year 2000, I was a locomotive engineer, and I've done that for most of my career. So very involved with operations and how the real railroad works. I spent 7 years as a supervisor in rail car distribution. So I distributed rail cars. So I got to see that part of how the railroad operates. And I learned a whole lot about how cars make it to customers and how that really, I gained a whole lot of knowledge about railroad operations then at that time. So I wanted to try to incorporate what I've seen on the prototype into my operations on the Seaboard Central, because my goal of the Seaboard Central has always been for it to be believable and for someone to think that it could be a real railroad, a freelance railroad could be a real railroad. So whenever I have a guest over to operate, I want them to go away with a sense of accomplishment, like they actually performed some type of work that the railroad performed just like a real railroad would do. We served the customers, and we got the cars where they needed to go, and hopefully everybody had a great time doing it.
Yeah, that's kind of the pinnacle, like we were talking about earlier. When somebody actually thinks your railroad's a real railroad, right? When they search it like the old V&O, and people used to say, oh, that's not a real railroad. Right. I mean, that seems to be like the target of a freelancer.
Yeah, I would love for the Seaboard Central to one day be thought of something like the V&O or Eric Bruman's Utah Belt, that's probably the freelance railroad that the Seaboard Central drew the most influence from, was the Utah Belt, because back in the 1980s, you were seeing it appear in Model Railroader and Railroad Model Craftsman. And I just thought it just looked real to me. And it, like Tony Custer's Allegheny Midland, that was another freelance road that had a realistic appeal to it. So that was something that made me come up with the idea of creating my own freelance railroad. And how I came up with the name Seaboard Central is it comes from the lines that the Seaboard Central operates over, which are former Seaboard Coastline and former Central of Georgia trackage. Now, when I was trying to create the railroad itself, I was looking to see what was actually going on at the time. And at the time, these were secondary lines, and in some cases, they were lines that are abandoned even, or parts of the line have been torn up. And I kind of looked at the map and I saw, well, here is a way I can take these secondary lines and have a track that moves between Birmingham, Alabama, all the way over to Savannah, Georgia, using the old Seaboard coastline that ran between Atlanta and Birmingham, and also using the central of Georgia that bypassed Atlanta, that went down to Macon, Georgia, and then the old Seaboard coastline that runs from Macon to Savannah, which is technically the Georgia Central today, but in my history, it's the Seaboard Central. So one of the things I just did recently with my locomotive roster videos was I talked about the years that the locomotives appeared on the line, and I looked at what actually occurred in real life. So, for example, in the year 2004, the CSX sold off the portion of their line from Birmingham all the way up to Guntersville, Alabama, and that was when the ATN Railroad was created, the Alabama and Tennessee River Railroad. So I thought, well, here, this existed within my time frame. So I said, well, in 2004, instead of the creation of the ATN, it was taken over by the Seaboard Central. And that's when I knew I would need more locomotives. And so I was using that. And so I was looking at other cases where, for example, in the year 1990, that's when the Georgia Central was created. So I thought, well, there was a good starting point for me. So anyway, now that I modeled the year 2015, the summer of 2015, that's where I stopped the clock. I didn't want to go any further for a couple of reasons. I had actually paid someone to weather up and letter some cars for the Alabama and Gulf Railroad that had fallen flag logos still on the sides of the box cars, but they were just patched for the AGR. So these were really cool fallen flag roads, a lot of good rust effects, graffiti was on the cars, and he made them look just like the prototypes. And if I would have kept the layout moving current moving forward, those cars would have had to been repainted just like the real cars were. They would have just ended up in the mineral red, boxcar red paint we see today. Mm-hmm. But the second reason was that was the year I married my second wife. And my wife, Katja, she is a huge supporter of the Seaboard Central, has been the whole time. And so in honor of her, we got married in the late spring, early summer time period. I thought, well, that's when I'm going to do it. I'm just going to stop the clock here in 2015, and that's when I'm going to focus on 4 months, the months of May, June, July, and August. And so that's when the Seaboard Central operates. So it's this podcast will come out in September. So on the Seaboard Central, that means it will be May of 2015. And it just keeps going that way.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your locomotive roster. Do you have locomotives that fit right into that time, that era that you're modeling? Like, did you actually use locomotives with the same numbers that were in that time period?
Well, okay, this is a good question, and a lot of people don't think about it. My goal, like I said, was for the Seaboard Central to be believable. So that means that I had to look at other railroads, like your railroad, for example, that you modeled, the Providence and Worcester. What kind of power?
Yeah, we gotta stop and fix that.
Stop.
Whatever, I can't say it.
It's Providence and Worcester.
That's the P&W, okay? Okay. So you got to look at what kind of power would they be purchasing. Look at the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern. That'd be similar railroad. You can look at the Susquehanna Railroad, the NYSW. All these kind of regional railroads, because the Seaboard Central is essentially a regional railroad. So a regional railroad generally does not have the funds to buy a brand new locomotive straight from the factory. They go to the used locomotive market. Okay? So you have to look, all right, in 1990, for example, when the Seaboard Central started with that first section of track, what kind of locomotives were available for purchase on the used locomotive market in the year 1990? And that's when you would have units like your GP9s and GP30s, GP20s, maybe some GP38s, because what happens is the Class 1 railroads will cast off their older units as new locomotives start showing up on the property. And you'll see them purge their rosters from time to time. And they like to purge their rosters of oddball units because they want to keep a Class 1 railroad is going to hang on to the units that are the most reliable, the ones that they have the most of because they have ample part supply. So you start seeing the unique locomotives are to be the first ones to go. So your regional railroads will often pick these up. That's how you saw the GE units on the P&W because they became available as the Class 1s cast them off. So the same thing on the Seaboard Central happened in 2006. The NS got rid of the Conrail B40-8s. So I used that date since that was when NS cashed those units off because there were only 17 of those units on the entire roster. And so NS said, look, it's not like we have 250 SD40-2s. We have only 17 of these units. So they got rid of them. Even though they were decent, fine engines, there was nothing wrong with them. They just got rid of them because they didn't want to have to keep a part supply for that particular model. You know, they wanted modernize their fleet. As more new locomotives came online, they were looking at getting rid of certain engines. So you saw them they got rid of the MP15s, things like that. They would trade locomotives with other railroads. So the regionals benefit from this. So that's how you see the SD38s or the SD39s get picked up by a regional railroad because there were so few of them on the Class 1s, and they'll just rebuild an SD40 for that. As the SD40-2s get bumped out of mainline service to yard service, it bumps those other engines out of yard service, and they go on the used locomotive market. The Seaboard Central is tapped into that used locomotive market. So I look at the particular year of when I need that power and what type of locomotives would be available. So, for example, in 2004, I looked at what did the ATN roster when they started in 2004. You saw 3 SD40 T-2 tunnel motors, a couple of SD40 5 T-2s, maybe an SD45R, pair of GP20s, 2 unique GP40-2 LW units, Canadian National engines, are now in Alabama. And people ask me, why do I have 2 Canadian locomotives on the Seaboard Central roster? Well, I have an excuse because there is a real short line in Alabama that rosters a pair of them. And I just use examples from real railroads for the Seaboard Central, how I came up with my real diverse mix of locomotives on the SC.
So you froze your layout in 2015. So your locomotives that you have in your layout are in the time span between you started to you ended. You don't have anything below that, and you don't have anything above that time, correct?
Well, I have locomotives. Some of the locomotives that I say that started out in 1990 are no longer on the roster. They've been scrapped or traded in. So I have the active fleet that is in 2015. One of the things, I also run a couple of run-through Norfolk Southern trains over the layout. So since I modeled 2015, that means that I'm not using any Tier 4 locomotives, for example. Okay. So I don't want Tier 4 locomotives because they didn't come out to 2016.
Right.
Yeah, so I try to look at. You see a lot of second generation EMD units, other than the B40-8s. It's mostly just second generation EMDs. The oldest locomotives I have that are active on the roster are a pair of GP30Us, and there's only 2 of them left, and they're in work train service. So everything else is all second generation EMDs. And that would look like a typical regional.
Right. So, I mean, I pretty much do the same thing. So I froze my layout in December 16th of 2016 because that was I think that was the day that the P&W the GNW took over operations of the P&W. So, but before then, they've sold off a bunch of the U-23Bs. I've gotten rid of them. I think I have. The only thing I got left is a B-23-7 of those. I got all the GP-38-2s, the 6 of them, and I have I don't have the 2007 because I sold that to a buddy of mine 10 minutes away with a P&W layout because I wasn't using it anyway. So, and I got all the 40-8s, the 39s, the 40s, and what I ended with was the 3 BNSF units they got. Well, the 2 BNSF units and the 1 ATSF unit that they got from the Burlington Northern BNSF that they repainted. Now, I go one more step. I only have one of those locomotives painted in the brown and orange. The other 2 are still in the BNSF paint scheme because when I froze, those locomotives were still painted in the BNS paint scheme. So that's it. I'm done buying or selling. It's just stuck in the middle there.
I guarantee you, if you asked any P&W engineer, they'd probably say good riddance for those U-23Bs and B-23. That is the worst locomotive I have ever operated in my entire career. I operated a B-23-7 on the NS when we still had some, and I'm telling you, there's nothing worse than the old U-boats. I can tell you that for a fact. What a piece of junk. But that's just from an engineer's point of view.
This all takes me back to the conversation I had with Michael Gross, and Michael Gross used the term art is a form of protest. And I guess this is kind of like Don's protest and maybe a little bit of yours as well, Tim. And I also think it's neat to hear those that have set dates that are so firm that, as Matthew Fricks would like to say, guardrails, right? They set up these really tight, narrow guardrails that keep you kind of in focus and allows you to not jump at the next shiny thing because it doesn't fit. I stopped here and I'm not going any bit forward. Definitely helps the wallet for sure.
Yeah.
The only thing that I've done on mine is I had 2 of the SD60Ms, the 6-axle jobs, and I didn't care for them. They didn't good running locomotives, and I'm real particular on how my locomotives run. So I sold those because on this layout, 6-axle locomotives, I don't need them. You know what I mean? I got half of my fleet is still in a box for 5 years. I have never used them.
Yeah, it depends on the line. Some lines are restricted from 6 axles. For example, on the Seaboard Central, well, it's the Georgia Central. The line between Macon and Savannah is restricted to 4 axles. I can't use a 6-axle locomotive if I was modeling that particular line segment. I'm modeling the railroad. Part of the railroad that I'm modeling will be mainly focused around Carrollton, Georgia, which is still controlled and owned by Norfolk Southern today. So I have access to those particular industries. I know I can pull waybills on cars that are destined for those industries, so I know where the cars are originated from and all that stuff. So that helps me out when I'm planning my operations. Another thing that I do as far as operations is Federal Railroad Administration classifies tracks, and you guys may have heard the term Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, and so on trackage. When the FRA designates the track, like for example, the line that I operate on is considered Class 4 trackage that runs, my district that I operate over runs between Atlanta, Georgia, and Greenville, South Carolina. That means that the track is good for 60-mile-per-hour freight trains or 80-mile-per-hour passenger trains. That's FRA Class 4 designated trackage, okay? The Seaboard Central is all Class 2 designated trackage. So what does Class 2 mean? That's 25 miles per hour freight trains. So, and 30-mile-per-hour passenger, even though I don't have any passenger trains, they limit. And the reason behind that, they look at as tolerances. The FRA determines what the condition the track is in, And for a railroad, say like a branch line that a class 1 has downgraded to class 2 trackage and limited the speed to 25 miles per hour. That means they don't have to perform as heavy duty maintenance as they would the class 4 trackage. Down where you live in Florida, Don, the Bright Line has class 7 trackage between Orlando and Cocoa Beach. Class 7 is 125 mile per hour. The tolerances on class 7 compared to class 4 is astronomical. The difference, the tighter the tolerance, and it requires a lot more investment in maintenance to have 100. Think about class 8, 150 mile an hour trackage. That's the highest in the United States is class 8.
That'd be the Northeast Corridor?
Small section of the Northeast Corridor would be class 8, just a small portion of it for 150 miles per hour.
Right. Yeah, a straight pot.
So most of your class 1 freight lines are class 4. Most of your secondary lines, maybe class 3 is 40 miles per hour. I don't know what the P&W is, if they're 40 or 25, class 2. But there's also a class 1 trackage, which is 10 mile per hour, and you see that on some short lines. But anyway, 25 mile per hour, what I do with my locomotives, I've got them all programmed to max out at 18. So I use the proto throttle to run my trains. So have you guys operated with a proto throttle before?
I have one.
Okay. The way I run mine, notch 1 would be 2.5 miles per hour. Notch 2's 5 miles an hour. Notch 3's 8 miles an hour. Notch 4 is 10. Notch 5 is 12. Notch 6 would be 14. Notch 7 is 16. Notch 8 is 18. Now, of course, I can hit the drive hold and I can rev it up higher. So it could be going 10 miles an hour in notch 8. But that's the way I did it. So I also have the deceleration value maxed out at 255. That means you have to use the brake to stop.
Right. That's what I do.
And I have the emergency brake feature cut out of my proto throttles.
Yep. It's you pretty much got mine set up the same way.
Yeah, I found that I was able to program my decoders because I have all of my decoders have ESU decoders, Loc Sound. Most of them are all V5s. All of them have the current keepers. And a lot of my locomotives have scale sound system speakers. Some of them are factory from scale trains. But I've programmed them. What I've done since I operate the real one for a living, I started looking at how long it takes for an SD40-2 to move from a complete stop. How many seconds does it take for it to start up and start moving? So I wanted to get something similar out of my models. I wanted to get that delay. I didn't want it to automatically start up as soon as you. So I set the acceleration value to 28, and that gives me a good acceleration value for those second generation EMDs.
I think that Tim's getting about an A+ in your book, isn't he, Don?
Yeah, no, he checked off a lot of the boxes that I do too.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. My question is though, Tim, do you have other operators operating on your layout? And if there are they using? You got enough proto throttles for everybody, or you have to revert back to cabs for them? And how does that affect the performance of your locomotives?
Right now, I have 2 proto throttles, and at the size of the railroad right now, that seems to be okay. Because the way I operate in my operating sessions, I have an engineer and a conductor. So I have, just a handful of people over to operate. So normally it's 4 or 5 people that are here. What I use for my conductors is I give them a clipboard. I print off an actual industry work order. So it tells the way the prototype does things is each industry has an alphanumeric classification code. So that in a real life, real conductor, if you operate the same route, for example, the route that I am on right now, I can tell you every single classification code of every industry because I work the route all the time. But if you ask me to go to another local on my same district, I wouldn't be able to tell you that because I don't work those industries all the time. And so you just start remembering them. And so each day a conductor comes on duty, they get their industry work order. They know which industries they're going to work that day, which cars are needed from the yard to be lined up in their train, which cars that need to be pulled from the industry. I wanted something similar to that, what I was seeing. So I made a much simplified version of the prototype-based industry work order that we use on NS, and other forms of paperwork. Like for my main yard, I use track inventory worksheets. But for other conductors, I also give them a blank switch list so they can write out their train. They can write out each car number on their train when they're coming back in the yard, and they know exactly the classification where the cars the next block the car's going to be blocked to. So, for example, a train can leave the main yard, go work industries. When it comes back in, it could pull blocks going to the CSX or NS or BNSF, or it could pull a classification code for Macon or Carrollton or different classification codes. So that it seems so realistic when you actually do it, when you actually perform the work. So I have a yard job that just focused on the yard. I've got industry jobs that work industries, and then I've got through freights. And I actually have the two NS run-through trains that don't do anything but run from station to station. They're just haulage rights trains that operate over the line. And that was from my original Seaboard Central layout that I'm going to bring forward to this new layout. So it's going to be once the layout is fully built out, it's going to have a whole lot. It's going to take probably at least 4 or 5 proto-throttles to operate it. But that's down the road.
You got a big investment to make there.
Yeah, for sure.
That's when I retire.
So anyway, what I was going to ask is that, so you say you got 5 operators and you got 2 proto-throttles. Do you have a full-time yard master working the yard and he just uses a regular throttle for now? Is that what you do?
So right now, the way I have the layout set up in its current configuration, I call it the west end is phase 1. I'm going to build the layout in 3 phases. So right now I'm working to complete phase 1. And phase 1 will take care of my main yard in Gadsden, Alabama. It will, you leave the yard, you'll go up a helix, and you'll go into a place called Ragland, Alabama. And in Ragland, we have a couple of industries, a large cement plant that loads out cement hoppers, and then an ethanol plant that gets corn and loads out cars of DDG and ethanol. In addition to that, I also have a couple of staging tracks that represent the Birmingham interchange with the CSX and the BNSF. So the way I want to operate the layout is I don't want all the trains running at the same time. Just like the real railroad, you have a 24-hour period. So your first shift, you have a first shift yard job working the yard, and you might have that local that runs up to Ragland that works the industries in Ragland and comes back. And second shift, you run the transfer job that goes up the helix to the transfer yard. And the way I've got it set up, because that would be just such a quick run to pull a train into the transfer yard, grab the other cars and come back to the yard. What I'm going to do at that point is, if you're working the transfer job, once you get up to the yard, you take the same proto-throttle and you come around to the ADM plant and you run the actual plant switcher that's inside the ADM plant. Because the previous job had just delivered the inbound cars. And so now that'll give the yardmaster in Gadsden enough time to be working the yard in Gadsden while the person that ran the transfer job is working the ADM facility. They get finished working the ADM facility, park the plant switcher, get back on the transfer engines, get the other cut of cars, come back down the helix to the yard. And so that whole cycle that helps to bring new cars into the yard. Plus, I also have an NS transfer job and a second shift yard job that works some industries right there in Gadsden. So there's a lot to do in just this small amount of space, but you've spaced them out into kind of like two operating sessions.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how familiar your operation is with my operation. It's almost the same thing. I got a couple of local jobs that go out in the beginning of the session with 4 guys. We only have 1-man crews. We don't do 2-man crews, and I usually do the yard work, and I'm making up the interchange train between Worcester and Valley Falls. And that train can't run until the 2 locals are back, because the interchange needs the cars to come back off the locals and move them back to Worcester. It's a very familiar scenario from what you do to what I do. So, but the thing I want to really know is, how do you use your prototype experience, and what do you use for practices on your model railroad?
Okay, well, before I get into that, we were talking about the 2-man crews. So we start out with the conductor and the engineer working the job. So when we switch go to the next shift, then they can switch.
Okay.
So the guy that was working the conductor on the first shift, now he's the engineer, and the guy that was the engineer. So that gives everybody a chance to use the protothrottle.
Right, I understand.
And the other person can be uncoupling the cars and keeping up with the paperwork. So now let's talk about the how I bring the prototype in there. And this is where it depends on how deeply involved you want to get into it, because some people can take it to the extreme where you want it to stay fun, but you want it to stay realistic and believable. Okay, so on the real railroad, we have rules, and I know you had an interview with Dustin, and he got into some of the rules. Well, there's rules that govern the movement of trains and engines, and this is associated no matter what railroad you're on. It's probably the same number. At least I can give you the ones that are on the NS. So on the Seaboard Central, there's 2 different rules that we use for that govern the movement of trains over the line. The first one is rule number 93, and that governs main track within yard limits. So if I showed you my track plan and you saw the Gadsden yard and the helix trackage, all of that is covered under Rule 93 yard limits, which yard limits means that a yard master or a train master is in control of all the movements, and you contact any train entering that before they can pass the yard limit sign, which is posted. They have to getting permission to enter into that limit. And that's and they're directing all the movements that are made in Rule 93 territory are made at restricted speed. Restricted speed being having to stop within half of the range of vision, short of any kind of obstruction or train, not exceeding 20 miles an hour. Now that's on the main line. Any track that's not considered mainline track, with this yard or industry track, is 10 mile per hour maximum speed, and that's everywhere. Now the other rule outside of yard limits is rule number 171, and that is called non-signal track governed by mandatory directive, otherwise known as track warrants. Or today we call them track authorities that are issued by a dispatcher. So once a train goes up to Raglan, they're going to have a track warrant to operate in that particular territory. So I made a simplified version of a real prototype track warrant. So that is the only way. Once the dispatcher issues the track warrant, depending on which box they check, will determine whether that train has exclusive rights in that limits. And you have to set up limits. You have to put mileposts on your model railroad and say, these are your limits, that you cannot exceed this limit. That's the limit that your track authority governs or your track warrant governs. So I went in and installed some mileposts to give an idea, so my crews know what to use. Now, I don't use signals on the Seaboard Central because the real lines that I model are all dark territory. They're non-signal trackage. The Seaboard Central is not a Class 1 railroad. We don't run 50 trains a day. there's only about four or five mainline trains that operate. Maybe three in each direction, mainline trains, and that's not counting the locals. So if I did operate, like the line that I operate in real life is considered 261, Rule 261, that's track signaled in both directions covered by CTC signals. So me personally, if you belong to a club where you could set up a mega size layout, I could see CTC signals being real fun. But for most model railroaders, we just don't have the space for that. So I find that having my model railroad set up in this fashion is the most realistic, but it's most fun for me. So that's where I talked about it depends on how deep you want to get involved.
Well, I think for mine, I know that, for small layouts, what I like about it, and I run track warrants on my very small switching layout. And what I find is it eats up a little bit of time too. A little bit of filling out some paperwork, not a ton. I don't want to make it homework, but I think, the basic track warrant that they run up here on the P&W is pretty simple. Don actually dispatches it when it's up and running and hands out those warrants. And it definitely helps with that. Do you find that your operators buy in and with the paperwork aspect? Because I know some people kind of get uncomfortable or just don't feel like writing stuff down or doing paperwork. Do you have any issues with that, Tim?
I haven't. Most of them probably think it's cool because even if I provide a copy of their dispatcher bulletins, like I can just make up some train clearance with dispatcher bulletins. There'd just be something simple. It might add something fun to it. Like, for example, you could put a slow order in there, like over a certain crossing. Say you have a false activation. Just throw something up in there to make it more interesting for them. They have to be looking out for things like that. That can add another layer of fun. But like I said, it depends. If you have a small switching layout, maybe you just want to have yard limits. I like to watch John, your friend John Farrington. He's got a beautiful switching layout. He might want to say the whole thing is yard limits. I used to work for a short line years ago before I hired on with NS. And one day the FRA paid us a visit. And now, mind you, there were only 5 employees. We were doing the best we could. None of us really was professionally trained. And they wanted to see us. We were operating a class 2 line where 25 mile per hour maximum speed. That's how fast we could run over the line. So they wanted to see us do a proper brake test. Well, the general manager was an ex-track supervisor off the Chicago and Northwestern. The engineer was a track worker off the CSX. Here I was, my previous job was running a steam train at Six Flags Over Georgia. So none of us knew how to do a real proper brake test according to the FRA. And the FRA is like, this train is not leaving this yard that go out to the interchange until you guys show us you know how to do a proper brake test. So how they got around it is they said, you know what, we'll just make the whole 17-mile branch line that this short line had yard limits. Because under yard limits, you don't have to do a brake test.
Just rewrite the whole rule book. Why not? Yeah.
They lowered the speed from 25 to 20, made the whole entire railroad yard limits, and they got away from that. So if you don't want to do the track authorities, you don't want to mess with any of these other rules that you think that aren't necessary, make your whole layout yard limits and be done with it. You don't have to issue track authorities. You don't have to do brake tests. You don't have to do any of that stuff. It's just a mother may I, like when we're working in the yards and there may be 4 train crews working in the same yard, we all communicate with each other to keep from running into each other, If we know, we're in the same vicinity as another train crew, we're going to be communicating with it. And so you can do the same thing on your layout if you got more than one train operating at the same time. If you're operating in yard limits, all of you should be running restricted speed and communicating. And that's why they do it on the prototype.
The difference between my layout and your layout is with this proto freelance thing I have over here. I have, even though the P&W is all dock territory, I do have signals, and we do operate with CTC and we do operate with a remote dispatcher. I wasn't going to do signals on this layout like I had on my last big layout, only because the layout was small. I didn't really feel as though we needed them, but I had this little voice in my head from Connecticut, but a good friend, Mark Herrick, and he was like, well, maybe we should put some signals in so I could dispatch it, because I dispatched his BNSF layout from Florida, and he wanted to do the same thing here. So I said, fine. So we put all the signals in, and it all works good. The guys that operate, they really like the CTC. They like to talking on the radio to the dispatcher and all that stuff. But some nights there's no dispatcher available. So what I do is I have two separate files on the PC. The one file's for ABS and the other file's for CTC. So if he's not available, then I just slap everything over to ABS and the signals just do their own thing. And then the guys just to keep them used to using the signals, have to obey the signals. And the only thing they got to worry about is if a guy's going to leave the yard, he's got to get permission before he can go. So I can look up on the CTC panel to see what's going on before I let him loose. But I wasn't planning on signals, but because of my good friend Mark Herrick, I have CTC signals now.
Like I said, 261 is CTC, where the dispatcher can control the signals and the switches. You can have 271, which still has signals, but they're all ABS signals, and they're controlled by track authority. So you have track warrant control in 271 territory. So they're all ABS signals. Only thing the signal does is tell you the condition of the track. That's all they do. The dispatcher has no control over the signals. The signal just knows that if it'll give you a clear if the next two blocks are clear. If only the block in front of it is clear, it'll give you an approach. That's all an ABS signal does.
Right.
In CTC territory, normally what you have is you'll have an ABS signal in between the home signals, the CTC signals. So we call it an intermediate signal. On the real railroad, you can identify an intermediate signal by a mile marker. A milepost number will be listed on that signal head, and that's your intermediate. Dispatcher has no control over that particular intermediate signal. It's just telling the condition of the track. The home signals are normally where there's turnouts located. Not always. There's some that if you're in territory where they have a lot of traffic, they might establish blocks. But for the most part, you'll have the signals located where your turnouts are, and in between you'll have an intermediate ABS signal. But in ABS territory, everything is ABS, and the dispatcher can't see you. The only thing they have to go by is the track warrant, the track authority. That's how they keep track of the trains. They don't know if a switch is lined one way or another. Not like CTC.
Well, regardless of CTC or ABS or even paper track warrants or whichever way you go, to me, it seems like it all bodes well for control, to be able to control the operators and set up a sense of reality with compression. You can't stretch a train out the entire layout and work. It boxes them into and contains them to a certain area, making that far more realistic.
I agree.
It gives them a challenge, and I can fill the track warrant out for them ahead of time and give it to them when they show up. For the operators, that here's your dispatcher bulletins, here's your track warrant, here's your industry work order, and then they got it all on the clipboard. And then here's a blank switch list. After you pull your cars from your industry, before you come back to the yard, you're going to make a brake test. And the brake test, I say, is write down your car numbers from the engine to the last car, write them down in that order. So they come back to the yard. Now we have the list of the entire train. We can figure out how to classify the cars. It's so much fun and so realistic to do it this way, because that's the way we do it every day on the real railroad.
Right. Yep. I agree.
Make it last. Like I've talked about in past podcasts, you're there. You want to be able to make it's not about getting the job done. It's doing the job. That's the enjoyable part. So all of these things, all to say to make that operating session last just a little bit longer.
So one thing I want to jump into here, we talked earlier about this emptying a boxcar from one side. And I asked you a question about that.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that would be such a great thing to add to your model railroad operations, is to have a car that can only be unloaded for one side, and that car has to be turned or whatever they have to do to get it against a loading dock to be unloaded. So now you explain to me how the prototype goes about handling that.
Okay, for people that don't know what he's talking about, all right, a lot of loads in box cars, it could be a load of lumber or it could be a load of pulpboard or something like that. The way the car is loaded would prevent you from actually unloading it from one particular side of the car. So you'll see these signs on the car says unload from this side only, or don't unload from this side, or whatever. So depending on the industry, you may only have a dock board on one side. The dock board may not be on the other side of the car. So before you can take the car and spot it in the industry, you got to make sure the car is turned in the right direction so that they can actually unload the car. So in that case, you have to have a Y. And I remember years ago having a lumber place that would get the cars like this all the time that unload from this side only. They would be loaded with 2x4s, and the way they had them stacked inside these box cars, they had to be unloaded from that particular side. And they would come in and they would be backwards. So now you have to figure out how to turn this thing on the Y. And I've seen it to where guys have completely screwed it all up and turned the engine, but the car's still facing the wrong direction. You know, it's like, what did we do wrong? We turned the engine, but we didn't turn the car. So in order to do this move, you have to picture in your mind the way a Y works. You got 3 legs of the Y. So you pull the car around one leg and you shove it down the other leg. And then you run the engine back the other direction, reverse, back the other leg of the Y that you just came from, run it down the other side and come grab the car from the other end. And then you have to push the car out and pull it around the other direction. What you're doing is you're grabbing the car from the other end. So you have to, it'll throw your mind for a loop, and you're like, how in the world is you think you turned it, but you didn't, you know? And so you have to really plan that move out ahead of time. And I've seen so many people screw it up.
Oh,
it is
funny.
So hilarious.
This is an audio podcast, so no one will ever see me sitting here on the desk with my pen as you were doing that. And I was running the pen down the Y, trying to figure all of that out, right? So I was taking the clip of the pen, and I was keeping it on one side to make sure I was that side of I was like, yeah, okay, I could figure that out if you shove that, but then you'd have to come back and then grab it. And then, that's quite a trick right there.
You either have to have a Y or a turntable. You need one of the two to turn that car around. If it shows up backwards. We used to get auto racks, loaded auto racks, that they could only unload them from one end of the car. You know, they only had one method. So they were loaded Toyotas, and they were coming from 2 separate plants, one in Georgetown, Kentucky, and I can't remember where the other one was. But anyway, one of the particular plant they were coming from, the cars were coming backwards. And so you would get a group of 15 or 20 loaded auto racks, and the cars would be facing the wrong way. So we had a large enough Y where we could actually turn that many cars and to go down this branch where we spotted the cars. And that was interesting to actually turn loaded auto racks. So it's not just box cars.
I'm going to need a bigger pen here to figure out the auto racks. A lot longer one. Might have to go get a stick. But that's pretty wild.
I never realized that auto racks could be unloaded from. Well, I didn't know they had them to unload from one side. I thought they were both. You can unload any auto rack from any side. I didn't know that.
It depends on the ramps. It depends on if it's a fixed ramp, they have mobile ramps where they can drive the ramps around to the other side and unload them from the other side of the car. But if you're shoving to a stub end track and the ramps are at that stub end track, then they can't back the cars off the auto rack. They have to drive them off. So they set the ramps up between each car, and they have drivers that drive them through the cars. Another thing with auto racks, you can't mix tri-levels and bi-levels, because obviously you can't drive a Ford pickup truck through a tri-level. That's not going to happen.
Right.
So you have to make sure you have all the tri-levels lined up in the right direction on one track and all the bi-levels. So all that stuff adds, people don't think about it when they're on a model railroad, but you need to think about what a bi-level is and what a tri-level is, and making sure you don't have, when you're if you've got an industry like that on your layout, making sure you have those cars separated when you spot them up.
Interesting. Very interesting.
The circus trains are, how they did the circus unloading the equipment was the same way with those, the old trailers on the flat cars. They had to make sure they were all facing the right direction. So when they shoved them to the end of the stub end track, that the truck drivers could drive the trailers off. Back in the old days when they used to load them that way instead of by piggy packer.
Right.
So hopefully I gave y'all some good prototype information.
Well, I was going to say, Don, what did we learn here tonight? I think I learned I got to get a job at the railroad to get all this inside information, because holy moly, it's just between Dustin and now Tim, the stuff that we've learned over the last 2 shows from these prototype guys.
It's incredible. I got a little list going over here, what I've learned tonight, because it's always something new. I mean, I've been doing this. I've been model railroad for years. I've been operating for years, but there's always, talking to you guys is nice because we get a real hindsight on how it's done on a prototype and how you can apply that to the model and make the guys actually feel like they really work for the railroad. That's what I get out of it.
Yeah, that's always been my goal with the Seaboard Central, to feel like you actually did some work on a real railroad. I want the Seaboard Central to feel like a real railroad. So when anybody comes and operates it, they feel like, well, I've been operating on the Seaboard Central. And even the guys that I work with, they rib me about it. But they understand. I'll say, well, I'm headed home to work on the other railroad. I'm on the Seaboard Central. So it's they appreciate it. Let's do it that way.
That's good. I've had a few guys on my old layout that used to work for the PNW operate on my layout, and they've, like I said this on the last podcast, they told me they feel like they're at work. So I'm doing something right.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Well, Tim, I want to thank you for coming by, telling us about the Seaboard Central and how Freelance Railroad still is providing prototypical operations through all that awesome information you were able to provide for us tonight. So thank you for coming by and sharing that with us.
Thank you, Tim.
And thanks for having me. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.